Hello, everyone. My name is Kolia Souza, pronoun she, her, and I'm the Food System Equity and Advocacy Specialist for Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. As we're getting started, please, all of you, feel free to take a second to let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat. So this webinar, Reflections from the Ground for Equitable Food Assessments, is the final installment of a three-part series exploring community food assessments. These conversations have been intended to explore the process of creating a community food assessment using an equity lens, from the basics of an assessment to foundational concepts for centering equity in the assessment process, to how to use an assessment for transformative community change. So during our first webinar, just for review, we discussed how to use systems and community development frameworks to guide and make sense of the information collected through the assessment process. Then our second webinar focused on foundational elements for assessments such as overarching frameworks, power dynamics, language, shared definition and agreements, and resources. And today we'll hear from two speakers about leading the assessment process from start to implementation with an equity lens, the challenges of transforming a traditional assessment approach to center equity, and how this transformation impacts the assessment process and results. Go back one more. So this series is a collaboration between Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, Food Communities Network, which works across Indigenous territories in Canada, and the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Futures Food Policy Networks project. So we will be recording this webinar, and we'll share the recordings with registrants at the conclusion of the series, along with any resources we've collected along the way. And then Karen Bassarab with Center for a Livable Future will provide a few details on that as we close out the session. Also, as always, some webinar housekeeping notes before we get to our presenters. During presentations, we ask that you keep yourself muted, but everyone is welcome and encouraged to use the chat box to comment on the presentation, to engage one another, and to share resources. And we've tried to design this webinar series to spark interaction amongst all of you. So following our speakers' presentations, we'll send you all briefly to small breakout rooms with a discussion question or two, just to prompt some conversation. And then we'll end with a panel discussion amongst our presenters, where we'll also get to any questions that you've dropped into the chat box. So with all of that said, I'm gonna hand it over to my colleague, Moe Garahan, who was also a presenter on our first webinar, to reintroduce herself briefly and introduce our speakers. And while Mo's doing that, we'll have a bio slide up for each of our presenters that you likely won't get to read in full here today, but you will have access to the presentation slide when we send out our resources. So Moe, I'll give it over to you.
Thanks, Kolia. It's my great honor to invite and prepare everyone to listen to Anon Xola Lololi and Don Morrison today. As Kolia mentioned, we're going to send out the lengthy, and these are just synopses of what each of these individuals have done in their decades of work and commitment to work towards Indigenous and Black food sovereignty, respectively. And what I want to speak to today in terms of my privilege to have learned from both of these individuals over the decades that I've also worked on these issues is that each of them has demonstrated a real commitment to their own communities throughout their efforts to also continually extend and work with settler individuals working to transform food systems. And that ability and effort and energy put into building bridges is what has advanced genuine opportunities for some deeper systems change that I think many of us are increasingly incorporating into the work that we're doing around Turtle Island, Canada, and United States. And both of these individuals have extended from their own communities at cost to the work in their communities to work across geographies, right throughout these lands, across communities, across themes, and have been extremely generous with their experience and with their openness to share information in reciprocal ways, especially when that reciprocity has not been understood well from settler community, and have continued to grace us with that energy. And I don't say this lightly. I know Don more than Anon, but I've been lucky to work across these 3 decades, watching both of their work, learning from it, engaging with, and watching the impact that they have both had, and deeply appreciate their continued interest in spanning and bridging across our communities. So with that, I'm inviting Anon to begin, and Don will follow.
Thank you, Mo. And let me see if I could get this presentation up, or I can. Okay, so I am honored to be here, and I thank the Almighty for giving me the strength to get up this morning to do this work. Of recent, when I speak on Black food sovereignty, I say I come to preach the gospel of Black food sovereignty. Nothing to do with religion. It's to do with the good news, the new paradigm of how we look at the food system and the decolonization of the food system. When we speak about the food system a lot, we speak a lot about agriculture. But from my understanding, a food system is everything to do with food, and how we look at food, and how governments and community have their conversations of how we look at the development of a sustainable food system so that we could have a healthy future. I know the conversation today is about how we look at community food assessments. Well, I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors from the continent of Africa, who originally settled in the province of Nova Scotia. And from that time to this time, the many communities of people of African descent. So I stand on their shoulder, and I look at the histories of these communities to do this work of Black food sovereignty. Speaking to the idea of a community food assessment of my historical experience from, I would say, as early as 1998, coming forward, in the early days, the first recollection of a community food assessment was from the Community Food Security Coalition. That was a coalition of food systems organizations across North America, Canada, and the USA. And it speaks to the idea of community food assessment in communities. And the focus was community food security. The new paradigm in the work that I've been doing, and I've been observing my sister Dawn's doing, is in food sovereignty of communities, specifically the Indigenous community in Canada and the Black community in Canada. And it's extended, I could say, for the work we do across North America and probably South and the Caribbean. I mostly speak for the diaspora, because African food sovereignty, although it's have the same historical experiences, we have a different to somewhat experience in especially North America, and even more guarded in Canada when we look at access to land. Community food assessment historically speaks, I would say again, food security. So that is where we might have a little bit difference in how we have this conversation. Because food security and food sovereignty is two different areas of work, at least for me. How we look at community food assessment. So there's food security assessment, and I know the new paradigm, we're looking at food sovereignty assessment, because there's the new kid on the block. There's the new happening. I spoke to a young class yesterday at Toronto Metropolitan University, and this is new. So for the last, I would say for the last 5 years, we've been mobilizing intentionally around Black food sovereignty in Canada. And Black food sovereignty, for my 30 years of experience doing this work, working in community, intentionally in the Black community, is that this is a new movement. This is a pioneering movement with how we look at engaging communities in sustainable food systems work within our communities. As you know, I live in one of the most, probably the most diverse city in the world, the city of Toronto. And engaging in this work, we do programming intentionally in the past in low-income communities. And that's with an organization called the African Food Basket. And that was the first people of African descent sustainable food systems organization in Canada, started in 1995. It's still going. I am now the executive director of a new institution called the Black Food Sovereignty Alliance that was registered in April of this year. It's April the 1st, but it's not an April Fool's joke, it's the real deal. So I will speak to some past history of the African Food Basket and also of the new direction of the Black Food Sovereignty Alliance. So when we speak about a sustainable food system, it's a food system that delivers food security and nutrition for all. The system encompasses everything from processing, packaging, transporting, food to consumers, nutrition, academics. For my understanding of the food system, is everything to do with food. And when we speak about Black food sovereignty, we're not just speaking about food and agriculture. We're speaking about that whole system to do with a particular culture, with a particular people's way of looking at food system. And we start with the history. So I like to use this as a beginning, because when we speak about food sovereignty, we, as people of African descent, we have to look back. Now, this, as you see, this symbol here is the Sankofa symbol, and it says to go back and fetch it. It's a bird facing forward, but looking back with an egg in its mouth. Now, when we speak about Black food sovereignty, we're also speaking about African food sovereignty. We're also speaking about that long tradition. And as you see with this symbol, it's a bird with an egg, okay? Both could be consumed and both have to do with life, but it also looks at the wisdom of learning from the past to build on the future. So when we speak about Black food sovereignty, and most of us know about Via Campesina and this new paradigm that was introduced in the food movement. It was food security, community food security, food justice, and I would say from as early as 1996, food sovereignty. And we look at ways to how we could make a better world and do our work in the best way we could. So, as I said, within the Black community, we have to look back, because our food experience as people of African descent didn't start when we arrived in Canada or we arrived in North America. So pre-colonial Africa was characterized by a wide diversity of societies. Africans had kingdoms and city-states, each with its own language and culture. The Empire of Songhai, the Kingdom of Mali, Benin, Congo were large and powerful, with monarchs heading complex political structures governing hundreds of thousands of people. As people of African descent, we have to look back. And I must say we have to look back very far, because Black food sovereignty, African food sovereignty started with the first African woman feeding an African child. So we're talking about a long history. So when we speak about Black food sovereignty, we're not just speaking as is done in food security and community food security, community gardens, school feeding programs, even a city Black food sovereignty plan. We're speaking about a long history of sustainable food systems with kingdoms in Africa, with cities of over 100,000 people, with libraries speaking to food, like the Timbuktu Library. So I would say we are the beginning of a new paradigm shift in how we look at sustainable food systems. So this picture is a good example. These are Egyptians loading a ship, according to my knowledge, to take this produce to the kingdom of Punt. And it's a papyrus showing this preparation for the Egyptian journey to Punt. So we're talking about food systems. This is the city of Benin. And it's in its heyday, it was a home that estimated over 20,000 people. By the 1st century BC, the Benin territory was partially agricultural, and it became primarily agricultural by around 400 AD. But hunting and gathering still remain important. In this picture, you could see in the background, the city, it's a depiction, I think, from a French artist of the city of Benin. The walls of Benin, it is said, as a city, was longer than the Great Wall of China. Then after these experiences, come the transatlantic slave trade. With the transatlantic slave trade, we're looking at history. What was introduced is white food sovereignty. People of European descent defining, continue the definition, because food sovereignty, white food sovereignty was in Europe before Europeans made their voyage to the so-called New World. I don't know how new it was when it was existing thousands of years before, but when they made their voyage, and this was the beginning of white food sovereignty, where they were defining their process of agriculture, food production, nutrition, and feeding communities. And the area of production at one time was rice. It enslaved people of African descent who were growing rice traditionally on the west coast of Africa. So this is the new journey when we speak about Black food sovereignty. Because when the Europeans came to this part of the world, there were lots of tribes. There was the English, there's the Scots, there's the French, there's the Dutch, there's the Germans, and many that I can't recall presently. But on these ships, there were also tribes. There were many different tribes, and these different tribes had different foodways. So that's another area of research. As I say, is an evolving Black food sovereignty journey. It's just a picture of how we came from Africa. And we came mostly from the western part of Africa. Western part, the central western part of Africa. From Senegal, went way down to Angola. We came all the way by the millions to South America, especially to Brazil, which is the largest community of people of African descent outside of Africa, all over Central America, the Caribbean, and North America, North and Central America. So what got us so interested in really intentionally introducing the idea of Black food sovereignty in Canada was these statistics. And the state of what race got to do with it in Canada. The rates of food insecurity in households in some startling numbers. And this research was done by the University of Toronto, and this was the statistics of the federal government of Canada, Stats Canada. And it just showed you the racial disparity, Black households in relation to white households. 10% of white households are food insecure, while 28.4% of Black households are food insecure. Now, I must let you know, this research was done in 2017. I will get to 2022, so you can see the stark difference between then and now. The most startling of information that come out of this research from Food Insecurity Policy Research at the University of Toronto, in collaboration with FoodShare, is that 12.4% of white children live in food insecure households in Canada, while 36.6% of Black children live in food insecure households. This is a crisis in our community. If there was 36.6% of white children living in food insecure households in Canada, this would have been a real crisis. And solutions, more intentional, would have been made available. So when we talk about food assessment, we have to talk about the equity between how we do this work. Now, 2022, the disparity of food insecurity for Canadian children. As you see, 1717 to 2022, just 5 years after. 19.3% of white children live in food insecure households, and 46.3% of Black children live in food insecure households. The impact of food insecurity on children's life: stunted, asthma, blood pressure. There's so many health issues to do with food insecurity that this is a crisis in our community. So this is really a rallying cry that we have to take it to our community. Now, I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I respect my white colleagues who I've worked with over the years, but I realize the intentionality of the Black community taking responsibility of the health and the food sovereignty is critical at the crisis stage. So my white colleagues who are involved in white food sovereignty cannot do the work of the Black community. The work has to be Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-mandated. We have to have a new paradigm of how we achieve food security for all. As you could see, presently, 39% of the Black community are food insecure. This is research from the federal government. 33.4% of the Indigenous community are food insecure. The children, as I just said, is 46.3% in the Black community and 40.1% in the Indigenous community. These numbers are crisis levels. The interesting thing about our work on Black food sovereignty in Canada is that we wouldn't be able to, we are not only looking at the state of food insecurity, we are looking at how the Black community could cooperate and work together. Because again, I think I live in one of the most diverse people of African descent cities in the world. And this is Stats Canada data. It says the Black population in Canada report the largest number of countries of birth, mother tongues, and ethnic or cultural origin among all racialized groups in Canada. Over 180 different countries, over 250 different mother tongues, approximately 371 different ethnic or cultural origins. So our work is not just on the sustainable food systems. Our work is the unity in our community. I was so surprised yesterday. I was doing a class at TMU, and at least I would say 70 to 80% of the students were Black students, and they didn't know that there was an African Union. And they didn't know, okay, there was a 6th region in Africa, in the African Union. And that 6th region is we who live in diaspora. So when we talk about Black food sovereignty, we're not just talking about food. We're talking about people of African descent histories. So Black food sovereignty is the right of people of African descent for healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture system. We see Black food sovereignty as a conversation with governments, with sovereign nations, with institutions, with community, whether it be federal government, municipal government, or provincial government. But there's a new paradigm of conversation of how we become a more food secure nation. So we started this process by engaging our community in conversation in 2019 in a partnership with the City of Toronto. There's a unit called Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. And that's for a whole other conversation, but I would just we partnered with them and we started engaging the community in conversation of what is Black food sovereignty as we see it at that time. And we want to hear the input of where we go with this kind of work. It's more like a community food assessment with a food sovereignty perspective of how we engage community. We talk about the state of Black food insecurity in Canada, and we talk about this emerging idea of looking back, Sankofa. And when we talk about looking back in Canada, I would say we're looking back at the work of the African food basket. Now, from the inception in 1995, the mandate was to be Black-led, Black serving, and Black mandated. And we started out as a food buying club, purchasing food for the most vulnerable in our community, because most of the population in Canada is as people of African descent migrate from the Caribbean in the early years. Actually, from the early years was the first community in Nova Scotia. And then we see another large migration from the southern US through the famous Underground Railroad by the famous conductor Harriet Tubman, who brought the enslaved from southern US to mostly Ontario and some parts of the West, and also on the West Coast. And we want to make sure that we start to look at, where we going with this conversation that we talking about Black food sovereignty. So we had 2 conversations, and we were supposed to have 4, but as everyone know, 2020 started off with the shutdown of the world, I would say. So we started doing things online. So we had these conversations online, and we continue speaking with each other. And the City of Toronto recognized this work, and we started talking about how we could put together the rights of people of African descent. And outcome of that was the Black Food Sovereignty Plan that I could say is one of the recent highlights of the work that we do. The plan had 3 interlocking goals: to develop city-supported Black-led initiatives dedicated to addressing food insecurity issues that disproportionately impact Black communities, identify and establish sustained supports and funding for food-focused B3 organizations that are Black-led, Black sovereign, and Black mandate, Black food sovereignty community infrastructure. Engage, align, and leverage new and existing city strategies and initiatives to advance systems change and share goals to realize Black food sovereignty outcomes. It's been going on, sometimes a little bit rocky road, but it's moving as the City of Toronto Black Food Sovereignty Plan. So we had the first conference in November 27, 2020. Then we had a second conference, and we invite our good sister, Dawn Morrison, because I would say as the Black community in Canada, we have so much to learn from the Indigenous community when we speak on the area of sovereignty in general. But food sovereignty, we were glad to have our dear sister, Dawn Morrison, present on the work that she's involved with the working group on Indigenous food sovereignty. And from that time, we develop a partnership that we communicate pretty often, whether in sessions like these or on other social settings. But we continue having this conversation. So on October 4, 2021, the City Council approved the first Black Food Sovereignty Plan. And it definitely moves us forward and bring us closer together as a community to start looking at this new area. The third annual Black Food Sovereignty Conference was in 2022. And in 2023, we produced the first Black Food Sovereignty policy paper. And we have a series of them going to be coming out, looking at policy pieces on Black food sovereignty and engaging community, assessing where we need to go with Black food sovereignty and having these discussions. So as you see, we also have partnerships with the City of Toronto. There's also with the different faculties at Toronto Metropolitan University, community organizations like NAPSI and CAFCAN, and our foundation, the African Food Basket. We just wrapped up our fourth Black Food Sovereignty Conference about a month ago, still speaking to the areas about how we could bring people together and move the agenda of Black food sovereignty forward. And I'd like to end with this pretty amazing comment from my dear sister, Dawn Morrison. It's amazing how many folks call themselves allies, but subtly or overtly avoid engaging with the most difficult issues. Avoidance and denial and unwillingness to speak out are ways to use niceness as a way to silence and oppress the truth tellers. Now, that is some serious comments there, because the work we do, we're not out to really chastise anyone, but we want to speak truth to power. And there's a similar comment from the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, where she called on the nation to accept some of the ugliest truths in its history as she confronted the debates roiling the country about racism and the violence against African Americans. In a speech from the pulpit of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Justice Jackson, the first Black woman to serve on the nation's highest court, said that she made her first trip to Alabama to commemorate and mourn and celebrate and warn. She was the keynote speaker to mark the 60th anniversary of a bombing by the Ku Klux Klan that killed 4 young girls at the church as they arrived for Sunday morning service, as famously remember in the civil rights era. If we are going to continue to move forward as a nation, we cannot allow concerns about discomfort to displace knowledge, truth, or history. Justice Jackson told a crowd of hundreds, it's certainly the case that parts of this country story can be hard to think about. I know that atrocities like this one we are memorializing today are difficult to remember and relive, but I also know that it's dangerous to forget them. We cannot forget because the uncomfortable lessons are often the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. She added, we cannot forget it because we cannot learn from past mistakes we do not know exist. So, and speaking of community food assessment, if you go on the internet, there are lots of information that could be misleading in our conversation. And I have been noticing there are lots of things on the internet that are not true. And we have to challenge these words as we move forward. Despite the merits in achieving food sovereignty can be challenging. Despite its merits, achieving food sovereignty can be challenging. Structural issues such as unequal land distribution and lack of access to resources often hinder communities from fully realizing their food sovereignty goals. Advocacy, policy change, and international cooperation and national corporations and communal cooperation are essential in creating an enabling environment for food sovereignty to thrive. Food sovereignty represents a powerful movement that places local communities at the forefront of their food systems. We can foster environmental sustainability, cultural preservation, and economic resilience by granting communities control over their food production, over their food systems. The journey toward achieving food sovereignty requires collaboration among governments, NGOs, and communities to create a just and sustainable food future for all. It's important that we listen and we have good conversation on uncomfortable truths. The community food assessment from the 90s might not be appropriate for the community food assessment of the 2020 somethings as we go forward. Food security and food sovereignty is two different ways of looking at moving our agenda forward. Because we all know that the food security agenda has been co-opted by the corporate food sector, but also it's a remnant of the past white food sovereignty as was employed in this part of the world. I would say we're in a process of decolonizing the food system. So we are at the beginning of a conversation to see how we could respectfully move forward with uncomfortable truths. Thank you so much for having me in this interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anon. And I think at this point, we're going to go over to Dawn. So Dawn, if you're ready, I know you said that you're trying to keep your camera off when possible, but it looks like you're good to go.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, I apparently I have an unstable internet connection, which is not very usual. So I hope that doesn't cause a problem. And I just really want to thank you, Anon. I think it's really critically important, the context that Anon set from the gaze of a Black food sovereignty leader in Toronto. The huge myriad of countries and ethnicities and cultures, and yeah, I guess the challenge I guess we have in thinking about assessment, and that really high cultural context is really important for us to understand and grapple with what an assessment could look like. And I just want to say too that when I think of assessment, I think of we're really assessing the key conditions necessary to support Black people and Indigenous people of color to lead and live the reality for ourselves. So anyways, I just really appreciate that context, Anon. And so yes, I've just taken notes. I'm not going to share a PowerPoint slides, but I'm going to, I usually talk without notes or anything, so it's kind of a little bit awkward for me to try to stick to notes. I might abandon them, but I just wanted to start off by talking about myself and my work. You've already introduced me, and thank you, Mo, for that amazing introduction. And yeah, I've known Mo for several years, and she's been one of those allies, like truth tellers and supporters of our work in multiple ways, and really expressing solidarity in meaningful ways. And I just want to, appreciate that. And as well as Anon, I know Anon, we go back since before 2018 when we led that boycott. And so when I think of that history and what the scale of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty that I've been leading and showing up for consistently for the last almost 20 years, I think about the scope and scale and that context, that high cultural context, and the cultural and political implications that I think are really important for people who are attempting to assess Indigenous food sovereignty in Indigenous communities. So understanding of how Indigenous food sovereignty is expressed and some of the work that nations or communities have already done is really critical, I think, to creating the key conditions necessary to support Indigenous leadership to lead and live the reality of Indigenous food sovereignty the way our ancestors have done for millennia. We've made major contributions to the food system, the global food system around the world, in terms of biocultural diversity of seeds, and some of the most of the world's major staple food crops come from Indigenous, very complex systems of Indigenous biocultural heritage. And so you could say in Canada, the success of Canadian capital in the global economy is in large part due to the exploitation of Indigenous land, Black people's labor, Indigenous people's labor. And so these are really important political implications to really think about what we're assessing here. I think it's important that the statistics that Anon had referred to, and thinking of that, the problems and how to facilitate assessments in a transformative way. So our Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty has become known for facilitating transformational learning in networks. Transformational learning in networks is something that has finally been validated within academia. Not that everything we as Indigenous peoples have done or have come to know over millennia needs to be validated by academia, but I think for assessments and looking at how and why assessments are being conducted, for whom and for what for, how is it feeding into the techno-bureaucratic framework for Western science-based resource management systems that really favors techno-bureaucratic elites in their ability to reproduce the same economic formulas that governments, have established, and basically, I guess the way that those frameworks enable some of the biggest transnational corporations who are favored in their ability to navigate that. And so assessments, I think, in the technical exercise of that is really a critical conversation that needs to happen and has happened within our networks, Indigenous food sovereignty networks. So I just wanted to start with kind of prefacing that critical, transformative, and proactive, kind of forward-looking approach that I think is necessary before or even in designing an assessment tool of any sort. And how will that assessment tool support Indigenous cultures or communities, nations themselves to scale deep into their own cultural capacity, to scale out into their own economic and relational systems of relationships, to support whether it's a small scale market and making that work for subsistence cultures and economies, because the subsistence economy, we often get defaulted into the capitalist kind of market-based approach, which of course we've had to adopt that, and we do engage with that under duress because we don't have enough access to our traditional foods that have sustained us for millennia. There's been a huge interruption of our intergenerational transfer of knowledge that's needed to hunt and fish and farm and gather and prepare our food and preserve it the way our ancestors have done for millennia, as I said. And so the capacity scaling deep into the ancestral foodways is a really necessary part for activating the economies and supporting Indigenous food economies. That is ultimately the it is the counter to the capitalist economy that we're seeing is very problematic for all people. So really looking at Indigenous food sovereignty as not only a way to, I kind of guess, address the huge gaps of disparity that are very similar to what Anon pointed out for Black peoples and people of color in general, and especially in a country like Canada, that is what the late Grand Chief George Manuel from my home community, he's now an ancestor, he wrote a book called The Fourth World Reality. And the Fourth World describes Indigenous peoples living in a first world country like Canada, but often in third world conditions. So when we think of that kind of that context, both the cultural, political, and the social context, how can assessments actually help and support us Indigenous peoples and increasing our agency to also scale up our capacity, meaning decolonizing policy, planning, and governance? How do we create the key conditions necessary for a whole new accountability framework? We cannot reconcile Indigenous food sovereignty within the same frameworks, policy frameworks, or techno-bureaucratic approaches that were designed to dispossess us. So when we think of creating those key conditions, I know that the Indigenous fisher peoples in South Africa have done some amazing work with the organization Massive NDC Development Trust, where they have also spoken about this, and I've done cultural exchanges with them over the years because we're aware that the system of apartheid in South Africa was actually modeled after the reservation system in Canada. So we could save food by the statistics that Anon referenced, and again, very similar to Indigenous realities. This is the food apartheid assists in Canada as well. But I think the system of apartheid, even more broadly than food, also exists still. We still have quite a long ways to go to really meaningfully reconcile or to have conciliatory relationships, knowing that there really was no conciliatory relationships to reconcile to. So again, if we're assessing the key conditions necessary, then we really need to assess what is our baseline for conciliatory relationships with the nation state. So I really appreciate what the late Justice Murray Sinclair, who recently passed away, and may he rest in peace and power. He was he released the report for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think that was back in 2009 or 2019? I'm terrible at remembering dates, but I'm pretty sure it was 2009. But correct me if I'm wrong on the dates, because I was never really good at remembering time. But yeah, he basically really did some good work to his life's work, you know, what the sacrifices he made to really shed light on what is needed for deep and meaningful truth and reconciliation. Basically, to sum it up, whole new accountability frameworks need to be conceptualized and implemented. And until that happens, we're still defaulting to the techno-bureaucratic framework that, yeah, just keeps reproducing the same problems. And so yeah, with the work that we are doing, this is where I've already abandoned my notes. So I'm going to look back at that. And I think that's a good context setting. And just to say, though, that I guess another important aspect of approach to assessment is a term that I learned that I feel really aligns with Indigenous worldview and the worldview that we're all related, that everything is connected, that everything is one, like the great Vandana Shiva, who talks about oneness, returning to the oneness. I'm aware Vandana Shiva also studied quantum science and has a quantum understanding similar to Indigenous worldview that sees the world as one living being and it being relational, everything being relational. So when we think of a new accountability framework and transcending beyond the arbitrary kind of political boundaries of created by nation states and the silos and sectors that have fragmented our understanding, the society's understanding of really what it means to be food secure and be in right relationship to the land, to the plants, the animals, the people that provide us with our food. And then as the concept of the human family expands and continues to expand globally, what does it really mean to live in right relationship with each other? So when we think of a new accountability framework, I feel like that holistic worldview and that approach that we need to take to assessments or to just supporting communities or nations to navigate this techno-bureaucratic monster, I'll say, because it is, you know, it's what keeps us oppressed. And so I'll go more into all of the aspects of that. I think that will come out throughout the presentation. But the thinking about the relational accountability, I feel like the process, the Indigenous methodologies, like really refining methodologies of assessments in a ways that align with Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and that holistic worldview. So in quantum science, there is a quantum theorist, a feminist, Karen Barad, and I can share the link in the chat after I'm finished talking, who teaches about the term intraactive. And I feel like that's really important kind of approach to think about how our agency and how, yeah, everybody's agency is entangled. So intraactive is different from interactive, where interactive assumes that our agency comes from us as individuals. While that's true to an extent, our agency is also intraactive in the way it's entangled with a system of relationships. So I feel like that is really, really key to that new accountability framework, to think about indicators that are relational, and to think about who are the actors, who are all the actors in the food system, and at what scale are we working at? What is the scope? And so mapping out those actors and doing the kind of preliminary work to understand the dynamics between the actors and how it's impacting the agency. And when I say the agency, I think of it like, and from the ground up. So the people themselves. And I think what's happened in colonial systems is that it's dispossessed the knowledge holders, the people, the oldest living memory of what it means to live in right relationship to our land and food system have been completely silenced and erased. So the elected system of politics doesn't work well. It's very divisive. It's, and again, it, you know, on reserve, the system of apartheid, it's a very, there's a lot of, there's a system of feudalism. I think we could say that more broadly, even in what we're seeing happen in politics. And so how do we build that baseline from the ground up and really look at the true knowledge holders who still live the you know, the subsistence cultures and economies that have survived over 90% of the time humans have been on the planet. So I see what happens in food systems discourse is that we're always defaulting to agriculture as the main narrative. And while I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be talking, like I do think we should be talking about agriculture because of the impacts of colonization and the ways that that for Indigenous people specifically, knowing that our real food security comes from our hunting and gathering, but because we don't have the access and we're not included in decision-making matters impacting our hunting and fishing and gathering areas, and the environmental racism, the environmental injustices that are happening, we have adopted agriculture. We've gotten really good at agriculture as well. There's a lot of historical documents in, you know, that were created during the fur and food trade days in the 1800s, and how we were commissioned to grow most of the potatoes because we knew how to work the land and without all the modern infrastructure. So, so yeah, I think really going back and centering our own narratives, making visible what was erased from colonial policy, from agriculture-centric narratives in food systems policy and planning and governance frameworks. And so I know that that's a big thing to say, but it's a really important truth to be told, and to think about how we can be guided in our approaches with under the four systems or four pillars of food justice that I've come to learn about through my role on the Indigenous Advisory Circle to the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And so we talk about the four pillars of food justice as building power, which is knowledge power, cultural power, market power, and political power. And so I really appreciate that, having learned about those pillars. And, you know, another important way to kind of structure our approaches in doing assessments that, again, will support the agency of the people from the ground up. So I'm not sure, how am I doing for time? I didn't check the time when I started. I want to.
Yeah, Dawn, if we could take maybe about 5 more minutes and then we could transition into some panel discussion. We can skip our breakout room so we can have some spaciousness to continue this discussion between you and Anon.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I want to, we know through Anon's presentation where Indigenous and Black people, where we share a lot of common history with apartheid, with exploitation of land and labor and slavery, and you know, the gaps of disparity and access to funding, access to land, access to control and decision-making matters impacting our livelihoods. And a lot of that is due to the white supremacy. And so we see that, as I mentioned already, in the narratives, we see it in the statistics. And so when we think about that and doing assessments in Indigenous communities and thinking about the safety, the cultural safety, I know myself, even as an Indigenous woman, going into communities, talking about food sovereignty, and especially the word assessment can be very triggering, because can be seen as a very technical exercise or academic. And I know I get myself, get challenged by the grassroots, the knowledge holders on the ground, who are the PhDs. They're the ones with the knowledge of the land, of the culture, of the language, and thinking about those aspects as indicators for assessing, where the true knowledge lives to achieve Indigenous food sovereignty, I think is really a critical aspect of this, and just the sensitivity and the courage that's needed to be able to go into community and also say that decolonizing is necessary to engage somewhat as a technical exercise, but acknowledging that many Indigenous peoples have adapted well and are also working under duress within the operating systems of the colonial reality. So creating cultural safety in those spaces is no small thing. I feel it in my body. We can often end up embodying a lot of harm. The triggers, the trauma is not, it is a genocide informed a practice that we need to apply when we really understand what has been lost and what comes up for people when we're discussing food and land, and kind of coming at this work from the deepest, scaling deep into a lot of that and what it brings up for people. And so thinking about, the wise practices, which is different from best practices that assume that there's one set of best practices for everybody, which fails in its ability to work in the huge diversity of Indigenous peoples. I know it's in Canada, the nation state of Canada, there is 98 nations of Indigenous peoples, and over in BC alone, in the westernmost province of BC, there's 27 nations, and 8 of the major Indigenous language groups live within BC. So there, BC, I think that the biological diversity in our province overlaps with the cultural diversity. But when you think of that in the scale of Canada or even the US, given that the Canada-US border is the longest border, most imperialistic border in the world, it raises a lot of questions of, what are the wise practices? How do we adapt our approaches to be able to have some level of preliminary kind of research or understanding before we go into a community of, number one, what work have they already done that could just be enhanced and supported, where it would be received well. What is the relationship that we have with that community? I know even within Indigenous peoples, like we're all different. And I myself have to observe protocols, and I'm not always accepted. It, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of build a relationship of trust before entering into a community, and facilitating a lot of the mobilizing the knowledge in our networks can sometimes be a very complex thing. But I think that comes back to the cultural safety and the humility, and what are the wise practices of leadership within each culture and nation. It's been absolutely phenomenal, my experience and what I've learned from the huge diversity, and not just in Canada, but other parts of the world as well. The most beautiful thing that I'll end on is that it's really powerful to see how I haven't entered into one Indigenous community where I wasn't, I should reframe that. Every Indigenous community I've gone to, I've observed them enacting rituals and spiritual protocols in relationship to food. That has not died, and that is powerful. The spiritual, the spirit is within. It is still there. It's just a matter of activating it, of facilitating that transformation, which we call as learning to rest in the fatigue of the intergenerational trauma of the place where the contradictions can seem so heavy. We've developed a third eye seeing methodology to create ethical spaces of engagement, and to give structure and tools and terminology to be in that process in food system discourse. But yeah, so I think that really building a wise practices around that, I think, is probably a powerful approach to building to food justice. So thank you all for the time and the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dawn. And just as I was saying a minute ago, I think we'll go ahead and skip over breakouts, if that's all right with you all, so we can keep in this conversation. So I'm going to take a moment to hand it over to my colleague, Keesa V. Johnson, who was also a presenter alongside Moe Garahan for the first session in this series, to converse with Anon and Dawn about what we just heard. So Keesa, whenever you're ready. And to all of you in the audience, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat box, and we will do our best to get to those as well.
Oh man, I'd like to thank both of you for just demonstrating such kindness in your work. I really appreciate how you approach the work from the spirit. And so my first question is definitely about that. Like, what does it mean to be a spirit leader in the food system? Spiritual leader, like, what does that mean to you?
For me, it means a lot, because it has a lot of tradition with it. It connects us to our ancestors, whom it's very important for us to really, as I say, with the idea of Sankofa and looking back, because I would say with people of African descent in the diaspora, colonization really did a work on us. And what keeps us going is the spirit. What keeps us going is the spirit of our ancestors and how we stay strong. Because a broken spirit, that is it. You're just an object. And we in this part of the world were seen as objects. When we look at for instance, if we look at the slave trade, the colonizers was just thinking about insurance of goods as a people. So when we talk about the spirit, you know what I mean, it's all through Black food sovereignty. You know, the way we farm. If you look historically in Africa, you see people farming and they're singing and they're dancing. Everything is like with that spirit. And if it's one thing, I just had over a year of Indigenous and Black food sovereignty planning. And if it's one thing I've sort of learned from the Indigenous community is the ceremony and spirit. These are communities who speak to trees, who speaks to animals. I'd look to some folks, it look like this crazy stuff, but you know, well, this is our way of life. That's what we do. So when we talk about, I know Don talk about leadership. Leadership is very critical in the work that we do for generations to come, and for these young new leaders, because there's so much distractions right now from the spirit, from really, you know, it is one beautiful thing I see of recent since COVID is we're giving acknowledgement to the land that we are on. That is spirit. That whole experience is a whole new paradigm in how we look at our conversations. So for me, the idea of spirit and looking at these traditions are very important. And as I show in the slide, we're from over 185 different countries, and all these folks in these over 300 different ethnic groups. All of them look at food differently. All of them look at food with that same spirit experience. So we have a lot to do and a lot to learn in relation to that question they asked. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anon. Yes, the spirit. I think one of the first things I learned from my elders when I started talking about food sovereignty, because in our languages we didn't actually have one word for that. Like it was our whole way we grew up, like it was a whole culture and a whole very high context, what we did every day, right? So but when we think of where our sovereignty as a word is very problematic because it's an English word and the etymology of it means to reign over, control. So the definition of food sovereignty, say at the World Food Summit, where the right to control our own food system is contradictory to the way we would think of it if we were to work with natural systems rather than control it. We don't actually control nature. It's the other way around. So it's like kind of deconstructing some of the terminology and recognizing that spiritually, our sovereignty, our ability to, our agency comes from Creator. It doesn't come from colonial policy. So it's like really decolonizing our mindset around what are we really giving power to here? Where does our true power really come from within? And so the teachings in my culture, the word for Creator is Tekalkupi, and it translates to the big chief. So there's human chiefs, there's the highest chief, and there's even different levels of I guess spiritual knowledge, and so I don't know that much about it as a spiritual person. I'm still just realizing myself. But yeah, the ceremony, which we can think of as just our dedication and our devotion to be in communication with our land and our plants and animals, and they hear us. I organize the Wild Salmon Caravan, and we do ceremony with wild salmon, and they come and we see things change. We've had bears come to sit in the ceremony and lead the whole caravan out of the ceremonial site. And these things are real. And so, yes, the ceremony, the rituals, the offerings, that we make to the ancestors. And yeah, I think when you think of quantum science, there's an acknowledgement there is a wider field of energy, and it's non-local. We don't actually always, we're maybe not physically connected to this energy, but we know it's there, and that is powerful. And the life energy around the whole planet is powerful to be attuned to that. So I think spiritually, those are fundamentally the narrative that we need to get back to. So when we decolonize regenerative food systems, that's what we're talking about, is reconnecting to that life spirit that's essentially been mechanized out of us since the Industrial Revolution, when the production paradigm was instituted. So productionism is, the mechanical worldview that has separated us from our own spirit. And I think on a social level, being a spirit-aligned leader is like being a better human and really looking at ourselves in it, because being a leader is challenging. That it comes with criticism, and that's to be expected. Actually, good leaders learn to receive that, and to look at ourselves in that, and stand in our power when we know like everybody is responsible and everybody's to blame, really. When we think of a responsibility approach as opposed to a rights-based strategies are important. I think there's a lot of contradictions in our work, like a lot of both and thinking, that is important for us to embrace as leaders, and embracing the contradictions and the uncertainty. And I think that's what enables us to rest in the fatigue of that intergenerational trauma and all of the stress and things that can block our energy. Also, like managing for the transformation of energy rather than for production is that is a spiritual, because it starts with us to be able to manage our energy. And I can't say I'm fully realized in that. I still embody a lot of, stress and trauma in this work. And so I think that's what leaders are striving for. And it's really important to model that, or at least learn and be human in the learning process of that, right? But yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you.
Okay, Kolia, do you want to field a couple of questions from the chat box? Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
There is one here for both of you about what would be necessary for decolonizing our food system, and especially calling attention to some of these institutional spaces like schools and hospitals and daycare centers.
Decolonization is a very loaded word. Colonization happened for hundreds of years, and it's not something to take light. I like to say it's an area of study because it's so complex, colonization. And colonization is about capitalism too. And we're talking about a great big monster. We're talking about looking at, like this giant of whatever it is that is consuming the world and destroying environment and lives. And so when we talk about colonization, as Bridget rightfully said, what would be necessary for decolonizing our food system? Our food system is a big, giant, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. So we got our work cut out for us, but we will be doing our part, one day at a time to make sure that we work towards being food sovereign. So it's a lot of work. Like a lot of my colleagues talk to me about allyship. And I like to say allyship is a study. That's supposed to be taught in university. That's supposed to be taught from probably high school. of how we could establish this allyship, how we could work together, how we could look at the area, as I said, the uncomfortable truths of white supremacy. We have work to do, and we take it with the capacity that we have to cultivate change. So, and it started from folks who should be conscious about what is necessary for change. And there are many areas that, that could be identified, but it's access to land, access to resources. A good example, one of the questions that Bridget poses, when we think about food service in public entities such as schools, as state schools, for instance, the Canadian government just made available $1 billion for school food programs. Now, this is going to roll out in 5 years. Black children are the most food insecure. So what are the policies with that 5 billion? That's what we like to know straight up front. There's school food programs across the country. There's not any identified Black school food programs in the most vulnerable population, as was shown forward by Statistics Canada. How are we going to navigate that? How are we going to do it in schools? Are we going to look at the Black Panther Party school food program, this food program that they had? So we asked the federal governments for money to research the approach that we need to take. And we weren't responded to, because we think that the government and the nonprofit organizations that managing that funds, they already made up their mind how it's going to be. When we talk about food assessment and process, these are things that we have to look at the new paradigm of food sovereignty and food security, because folks are still functioning as food security, but they make all the decisions even before they start planning. Because in the food assessment, you want to have a planning process. And you want to know what are the goals of this. Well, the goal is to look at the state of food insecurity in Black children if you're going to put out $1 billion. How are we going to roll it out? As I said, we need to do the necessary community food assessment, community food sovereignty assessment for Black children, so that we can have the best way to roll out these programs. Are we be just guessing our what was done in the past, people just making up stuff as they go along? Because sometimes to me it look like that they're just making up stuff, because to me I don't see the results that's necessary to create more food insecure communities in our community. Because in 2017 you have 36.3%, 36.6% of Black children food insecure, and then in 2024 you have 46%. Someone is not doing what they need to do. Someone doing what they're doing wrong. You look at food subsidies in this country and how much money that go to farmers. So when we're talking about a food assessment, and the new paradigm is understanding, what are the benefits? What are the cultural preservations when we're looking at feeding children? How do we look at the economic, resilience of communities in having these programs? Nutritional health, food sovereignty, talk about food culture. I was doing a presentation a little while back, some seniors, and I was supposed to speak to cultural foods because that's what I was doing. When my work with the African Food Basket, distributing food, establishing community gardens in all communities around Toronto, not just the Black community. And it just dawned on me when they were speaking about the residential schools, is that these folks who run the residential school, they don't have a clue of what Indigenous children needed to eat. So they probably feed them the wrong food and kill them off. That's why I find so much grapes. Now, these are things that we need to study. What was fed to these children? And these are the historical pieces that we need to look at when we're talking about decolonization. We need to put money in these areas. What were the foods that were fed to these children? So the colonizers probably thought it was a good idea of what they were doing, bringing these children take them away from the communities, put them in these schools, colonize them, and feed them the wrong food and kill them off. So we need to do the right research and hear the real truths of what it is. So when we talk about school food programs and decolonization, is work to be done. There's got to be studies. We gotta put ourselves in a position where we could bring the necessary folks with the right knowledge for us to look at these issues. So my sister Bridget, decolonization is a lot of work, and resources need to be put in place to do the necessary research to get the answers to the question you pose.
So Dawn, did you want to add to that too? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so with like in schools, hospitals, there is a lot of yeah, there's a lot of significance to, I guess, for indigenous foods and access to culturally appropriate foods in public institutions, of course, is really important, because children in public schools anyways are the most food insecure, and hospitals, I guess one of the things with indigenous foods and in food systems is that in many cases, the species are endangered and there's not even enough to feed us as indigenous peoples. So one of the contradictions that we would need to embrace is how do we balance food security across the board when the disparity within indigenous communities is not being addressed? Because, you know, making it available in public institutions then is we're creating our goal is equity in a system where we're not starting off with equity in terms of who is really hungry, right? And who are the most vulnerable. So I feel like assessments really need to look at that. It's who are the most vulnerable within these public institutions. And say, for example, in hospitals, like I feel like food security solutions and market solutions are false solutions, because in public health, food is a part of the problem. It's the kind of food or it's the lack of access to food and the chronic illnesses of, unhealthy food and unhealthy lifestyles. The epidemic proportions of chronic illnesses are in large, I think, food related illnesses, but there's many other factors at play too. So I think that public health crises and increasing access to healthy food in public institution is important, but whether or not those are indigenous foods, given that we have a lot of species at risk that maybe aren't even acknowledged as being at risk within the mainstream like environmental movement, right? Because we have, again, the narratives at play, the land ethic at play in mainstream environmental movement is not an indigenous land ethic. So there's a lot of complexity to that question that I feel there isn't a simple answer for. And also I just wanted to say that I have created an assessment tool. It's the 4th module in a toolkit that I've developed, and I put a brochure for it in the chat. But there's 4 bundles or 4 modules, and the 4th is assessing the key conditions necessary to achieve Indigenous food sovereignty within a system of relational indicators. So it's really, again, though, understanding where where the community or the institution or the organization, the nation, whatever scale that we're talking about or that we're approaching is really clear. And there's a good baseline understanding before we try to solve all these other bigger, wicked systemic problems, because it's, I guess, building our capacity to work in that complexity and form those allyships where people are willing to do the work on themselves to show up to that in solidarity with Indigenous and Black-led work, because that in itself is quite a yeah, it's a lot of that deeper work that, so I guess these wicked systemic, or what I call coyote problems, are not simple solutions, but I think they're important questions, and they're important questions that help us to kind of guide us on our journey and our process of coming to realize ourselves and all the complexity, and learning to work in that complexity is really probably the primary goal that should exist. But yeah, that would be how I see it.